spiritual pussy
enthusiasts.
pussy
enthusiast.
I am everything a God is, and a God is not.
In one aberration of Marcion's system, there were 365 of them. Obviously, they were day demons of some sort. So these were the things which were interposed between, and it was a matter of, in late Gnosticism, you see, the question of magic loomed here very large because, first of all, the general mental set of the Hellenistic world was favorable to magic, but a thoroughgoing Gnostic analysis would lead you to the conclusion that magic is ineffective, that only gnosis can lead you to salvation. But in the late period, this became unclear to the practitioners of Gnosticism, and so they proliferated extremely complex magical systems of words, basically, and rituals, we assume. But really, the only artifacts of Gnosticism that we have are carved gems, which are talismanic gems, usually with these archons depicted upon them. The casting of horoscopes was tremendously important in Gnosticism because that showed your fate. I mean, they took astrology probably more seriously than anyone has ever taken it because they were so caught up with the machinery of cosmic fate. These, taking a book from the Egyptian cults they contacted that were worshipping Osiris and Hermes Trismegistus, they had the notion of words of power, and they thought that as you threaded your way up through these cosmic shells, there were gateways, and you would be expected to have the correct spells, the correct words of power, the correct talismans to let you through to the next gate. And these gates were moving in constant relationship to each other, and you wanted to, there were moments of propitious death when more than one gate was lined up with another so that you could just shoot right through. So they really were very contradictory. It's the richness of it. Had they analyzed their own position more clearly and been more doctrinally consistent, they wouldn't have been nearly so interesting. But their own anarchy, their own devotion to, it was really a cult of individual responsibility, which certainly I try to connect to the psychedelic experience because I don't think it's valid without a sense of individual responsibility. And then it was a cult of this secret knowledge which was vouchsafed from within. And I want to say something about the logos in this, because many of you who've heard me before know that I associate the spoken voice of the psilocybin mushroom with the logos phenomenon of Hellenistic syncretism. For a Gnostic, the logos spoke gnosis, but it was not the same logos as the Platonists. For the Platonists, the logos was the world soul, actually the demiurgos itself. For the Gnostic, it was a way of gaining information from the higher and hidden All-Father using the soul as an intermediary. But in both Platonism and in Gnosticism, this contact with an interior voice through contemplation, which is giving true knowledge, was a mystery that was practiced and was very real. One of the wonderful things about Velas is he talks about, this is Philip K. Dick's book that I urged on you all, is he talks about the logos as a creature of pure information and believes that it actually came, or suggests that it actually came to Earth at a certain moment in time, around the time of the death of Alexander, and that it was a creature of pure information which could actually form a symbiotic relationship with a human being by being known. In other words, here was something which, when you found it out, it began to live inside of you. And he called this the homeoplasmate. The union of man and gnosis was the homeoplasmate. And of course, suggested that Christ was one of these people, and suggested that that the Gnostics were not kidding when they said that that the inner initiates of the cult were superhuman in some form. They had this symbiotic informational energy creature living inside of them. And then he suggests that this was the reason for stamping it out, that it represented a form of symbiotically fused humanity that was just unacceptable to anybody who didn't have anything to do with it. So that then at Chernoboscian, at the monastery, whatever it was, at Nag Hammadi, these cultists found themselves surrounded. They were essentially the last people to have the complete message of the Logos, and they wrote it down. Now, since it was a creature of pure information, writing it down didn't destroy it. It only froze it, as if you were to put something into a deep freeze. So they wrote down this information and froze it. Then everyone who was a homeoplasmate died, was killed, something happened. But the stuff was in the ground until 1948. And now, if you desire to become a homeoplasmate, you need simply read this book, and it will begin to grow in you. This is a slightly insidious slant on the notion that if you will plant but one mustard seed, but it takes it literally. It says, our faith is a living faith. Take it within you and let it grow, and it will, as though they were actually speaking of something which had a replicatory power beyond that of a simple doctrine. It is a fanciful description of Gnosticism, but I'm sure that it comes closer to the feeling of what it must have been, because they were really trying to inculcate this thing in themselves which would grow and change their view of the world by giving them an entirely new kind of information. Very similar. It's almost as though taking the mushroom and having its experience is to have it grow within you. That would be a very Gnostic way of describing it, to say the mushroom is growing within me. That's why I feel as I do, why I experience as I do. It's a faith which is a physical thing, which is intermingling and interpenetrating body, mind, and soul. And this is how they conceived it. This is what they hoped for it at its best. Yes, anybody else? Yes, in the back.
I was wondering, I've read a lot of Philip K. Dick novels, and he is, to put it mildly, rather paranoid. How much of his worldview of things in Velas is sort of paranoia or feel, not paranoia is a bad word, this sort of feeling of something overbearing, something ready to come down on you. How much is of that do you think is Philip K. Dick's, and how much is sort of this thing that he was describing?
Well, he wrote books more paranoid than Velas. If the final conclusion of paranoia is negative, I think the whole Gnostic thing is totally paranoid. I mean, the idea that God has abandoned you, that there is not one single clue in the entire universe about what to do about it, is a pretty paranoid view. I think that as far as Dick is concerned, I think books like The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch are a much more disturbing kind of view. I actually thought Velas was an optimistic book, although you might differ after you've read it.
I also noticed he had something in there. There was a point where he claimed that the early Christians, or some flavors of them, possessed some kind of, could I assume, consume some sort of, perhaps mushroom, perhaps something, and then sort of, to use a computer hacker term, dump themselves into this little symbol, and that they'd float around, they'd be sort of frozen in this little symbol, and then the minute someone 10 years later came down and looked at the symbol, they would sort of all of a sudden get two personalities.
Well, yes, that was a vehicle that he used in Velas. I think the book that comes closer to his view on these subjects, which is also worth reading if you have an interest in Gnosticism, is the Transformation of Timothy Archer, which is not science fiction, but which is a novel, thinly disguised novel about James K. Pike, who, if you will remember, was Episcopal Bishop of California in the 60s, and his son died, and he began receiving messages from his dead son and presented a tremendous mess to the Episcopal Church because they had to come to terms with this, and they did by having a heresy trial, and he finally died by dehydration in the desert near Qumran, and he had parked his car by the side of the road, taken a bottle of Coke and a road map, and walked out into the desert, 115 degrees, and was dead. And the book claims that he was close to the people who were unraveling the Nag Hammadi material, and that what was coming out of it was the notion that Christ was the follower, get that, the follower of a person named the Interlocutor, who lived 70 years before Christ, or 35 years before Christ, about whom nothing is known, but that the I am statements, the so-called homiletics of Christ, were actually statements drawn from this earlier source. Well, now this is a slightly hysterical version of what came out of Nag Hammadi and Qumran, but not that hysterical. There is enough material to suggest that Christ was someone's follower, and that what he was saying had been said a generation earlier by someone else of whom we have no trace. And, this is hot, hot stuff, because it just cannot be that way if you're Orthodox. And, but anyway, this was what Dick felt about Pike, whom he knew very well. And the Transmigration or Transformation of Timothy Archer is an excellent book to read to see how modern churchmen have dealt with this. It's scandalous that the Nag Hammadi library is not more widely discussed, because it represents the strongest doctrinal challenge to Christianity in its history. There has never been anything this explosive, because it casts such doubt on the moment of the origins, and such doubt on whether or not we have any contact with the career of a Galilean who was the son of a carpenter, and so on. It just seems to explode the entire foundation of Christian hermeneutics. And there's excitement in the schools of theology. They are totally aware of this, but it doesn't seem to have filtered down to the lay level, and perhaps it never will. It may be like the Grand Inquisitor. This thing coming out of the ground is the most unwelcome thing that could appear on the scene in modern Christianity. It fouls it up hopelessly. You realize when I refer to the Grand Inquisitor, I mean the scene in the Brothers Karamazov, the story of Christ returning to a city in which the Inquisition is happening, and his dialogue with the Grand Inquisitor, who knows full well that it's Christ that he's talking to, and who explains to him that he shouldn't have come. They have things well in hand. It's only going to make a problem. Any more questions? Yes.
Would you be willing to give a sketch of the conclusions you reached earlier about psychedelics and history?
Well, I by earlier, you mean before I got here this evening?
Well, the last couple of years.
Conclusions I reached about psychedelics.
He's never heard you speak before. He was wondering how psychedelics come in. What did you say tonight?
Well, I think that that this experience of true knowledge coming unquestioned from the outside, for modern people, at least for me, is only accessible through psychedelics. The experience of the logos, the experience of a speaking voice, a voice in the head which clarifies reality and directs moral activity. See, the New Age model for psychedelics has become shamanism. It's just fallen together that way, and there's probably no undoing it at this point. But only a small portion of shamanism worldwide utilizes psychotropic plants. In my personal opinion, it is the kernel of shamanism. But these other traditions may have as much to say about it. And I believe, that knowledge of history is like knowledge of your own life. You are partially amnesic if you don't know what happened in the 15th century, the 12th century BC. I mean, not that I know all these things, but I feel badly that I don't, and I'm working on it constantly, and it's good for you. It's no mere exercise. You actually do become more grounded as you find out who you are. And you recall earlier I mentioned the Gnostics said, whither have we come? Whence are we going? Who are we? And into what have we been thrown? And it seems to me a clarion call to the study of history, if there ever was one. So I illuminate the psychedelic experience because I guess I have the Platonic faith that time is the moving image of eternity. And what the psychedelics are doing are standing you in eternity in what Thomas Aquinas called the nunc stans, the standing now outside of time. And outside of time, you see all of history. What is that poem? I saw eternity the other night like a golden ring. Well, what you must see when you see eternity is all history at once. Well, it becomes important then to be able to interpret it, to know what slice of the mandala you are getting. And I don't know if you personally are familiar with psychedelics. If you're not, it must sound like a preposterous thing to say. But if you are, you know that historical movies are not at all uncommon, and that you dial up places and times and styles and motifs, and that it shows them to you. And I think all of these past ideological, as I said before, these noetic artifacts that we dig up and show each other. Here is the Osirian religion. Here are the sayings of Nagarjuna. Here is Marcion and his system. These things are aid us in formulating our own understanding. I think that the great wrong turning of modernity is the abstraction of explanation from experience, so that we have tremendous explanatory engines at our command, Boolean algebra, quantum physics, but they nowhere come tangential to experience, so that they are always like institutional faiths. I mean, who has ever seen a quark? Who has ever seen any of these things? And what we need are maps of the world true to experience. And at first, they may seem very quaint because they will be hundreds of years old or drawn from some bizarre religious or cultural tradition. But that is just the patina on the outside. When you knock off all the rough spots, as Hans Jonas did with Gnosticism, you discover Heideggerianism. You discover, that what first appeared very quirky and quaint and removed from our concerns is actually central. So I really think that the psychedelic meditation par excellence is the recovery of lost historical time. And I think William Blake lined up behind that when he said nothing is lost in eternity. And this is the idea that if nothing is lost, there must be a point to recovering it. Shaman, by the way, do not have history. Isn't this a strange thing? They couldn't possibly follow my prescription because it assumes a literate tradition of record keeping. What they have reference to are the great oral myth cycles that have been handed down to them. The two things are not that different, but we really need to recover the power of myth in our own lives. And it's very hard to know even what that means. But what it means is we need to begin to have theories of being that are true to experience. And taking of psychedelic drugs pushes this to a crisis level because the notion of experience becomes so expanded in the presence of psychedelic drugs. That's why I have said, a physics of experience is what's needed, and it's very hard to imagine what that would be. It would be a physics which would explain to you why the world is as it seems in fact to be, rather than a physics which explains to you that the world is, wave packets moving at sublight speeds according to these tensor equations. It's a perfect explanation, except that you can't find people in it anywhere, or the scale from which you are doing the observing. And so it's a task of 500 or 600 years to move away from a trend so overwhelming. But I think psychedelic drugs will be central to it because they decondition you from receiving doctrine from above. In other words, there won't be state faiths handed down. Everyone will be expected to make sense of their reality and to have a theory to lay back on their reality, which makes it more real to them. It's all about personal responsibility. And that's, I think, the major message of the Gnostics, that they were taking responsibility for their situation in the world, in a way in which these other Hellenes were not. They were running after less thought out ontological positions. Just, your everyday run-of-the-mill sort of religions. But the Gnostics were going much further. They were trying to come to grips with experience and being. They were very modern. This is why these moderns like Jonas and Rudolf and Heidegger and all these people have gone back to them so fruitfully, because they really formulated these things. Yeah.
What led the Gnostics to accept a dualistic conclusion?
It seemed to them absolutely self-evident, and I think that must mean that it was really a chaos in the Hellenistic world. So many people uprooted, so many languages, so many religions. To them, it was as obvious as it is to us that the world is a mess. I mean, if you were to ask the reasons for modern alienation, it's because we see that life is cheap, that politicians can't be trusted, that priests are scoundrels, that everything has played us false. And I think they felt that way. There was a real sense of loss and wandering. I mean, the great pinnacles, Rome was infected with a sense of its own vulgarity. That's why the empire spoke Greek. That's why everybody was educated in Greece. The empire was vulgar, and people who were intellectuals knew this, and they knew that it was based on human subjugation of other people, and that it was basically not a hopeful situation. It seemed obvious to them. And that's why I think it was a proletarian, largely radical, dissident kind of thing. It didn't make great inroads into the aristocracies. Yeah.
Isn't there a way in which history is part of the state faith? I mean, that knowledge comes down from above?
You mean that history is distorted for the purposes of the state? Yes, that's right. You're exactly right. But what confounds that kind of thing is every once in a while something like these urns full of texts come along where it's like, you remember the old ads for the Rosicrucians where the cowled priests are saying, "This knowledge must die"? Well, that knowledge, probably from the point of view of many, many people, should have died. The Nag Hammadi library, having once gone into the ground, should never have come out again, because now it challenges our faith. Yes, history is normally part of the state's machinery of repression.
Kind of like a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
That's right. Well, you know, I don't know, many people have said it, perhaps Hitler most recently, that history is the story told by the survivors. But you see, it isn't true in this case, because the survivors were all Christians. They thought they'd handled this matter at Nag Hammadi. But 1922 years later, it returns, and it outlived the survivors. The knowledge could not be destroyed, and now it's being spread throughout the world, and its great enemy, Christianity, is now 2,000 years older, too senile, too uncertain of itself to grab James Robinson and burn him at the stake and come and find all of us and stamp this out. So Jonas's book on Gnosticism, which is a wonderful book, is now slightly outdated, because at the time he wrote it, these things that from Nag Hammadi were only partially translated and understood. But yes, it's the uses of history are many. Any more questions? One more question?